Welcome back. This In this video, we're going to turn from what we call the besieged church to what I call the Constantinian church. Now, please understand, there's no, excuse me, there's no real, what shall we say, absolute truth to these titles I give them. They're simply given as an attempt to structure the early part of the Christian church and make the transitions more understandable. So we began with the Hebraic church, which was mainly just completely Jews, divided into the Palestinians and the Hellenistic Jews. Then we went to the Paulinian church, which was the expansion of the early church under Paul and other great missionaries like him. And then we came to the besieged church, the church that was besieged from without and from within. Now we turn to the next stage, which I have chosen to call the Constantinian church. Unlike the beginning of the besieged church, where we could not designate a beginning point because it began in different areas at different times, and the oppression was different in different places, the Constantinian church, we can absolutely exactly tell you when it started. It starts with the Edict of Milan in 313, in which the Emperor Constantine makes the Christian church legal. And in a matter of decades, the Christian church becomes the primary religion of the empire. From this point, the emperor had taken over leadership of the church, and they'd gone from being killed for their faith to the emperor leading church councils and giving the church money and building new church buildings, etc., etc. So how did the church go from being this persecuted minority to the religious leaders of the empire? You see, over the last 300 years, the church had been gaining steadily in membership and influence. Until this point, they were a significant percentage of the empire everywhere, and in some parts of the empire, they were the majority. Everything the Romans had tried had failed to crush the church. During the empire-wide persecutions of the 200s and the Great Persecution of 303, the church had not only survived, but it had prospered. Finally, the Emperor Gallienus, who had initiated the Great Persecution in 303, gave up in 311. And on his deathbed, he agreed to coexist with the church with an edict of toleration. It's I've got my tongue tied up. Galerius, G-A-L-E-R-I-U-S. It's early in the morning here when I'm taping, and I'm kind of not as articulate as I usually am, I hope. The Edict of Toleration for Christians just simply said, we're going to tolerate you. We're going to allow you to exist. We don't like you, but we'll let you exist. And he was on his deathbed, and he asked them to pray for him. He soon dies, and as usual, the Romans have a civil war. The Roman Empire never did figure out how to transition peacefully from one emperor to the other. They almost always had to have a big civil war. And so this happens. Constantine is the governor in Gaul, which is modern-day France and part of Germany and Austria. In 312, Constantine is crossing the Alps to fight the rival for the emperorship. And in a daring gamble, Constantine attacks them, and there's a battle of what's called the Malavian Bridge. And at this bridge, the other contestant for the emperorship falls off the bridge, and because of his heavy armor is drowned, and Constantine wins. But before the battle, we're not sure exactly where. It could have been in Gaul before he left, or on his way, or in northern Italy. I suspect it was probably northern Italy, but who knows? Constantine was a worshiper of the sun god, but he looks up in the sky, and over the circle of the sun, he sees a cross. And underneath it, the sun, are these words: "In this sign conquer." This was the Christian sign. He knew that. And he assumed this was the Christian God saying, if you follow me, you'll win. Not only did Constantine conquer, but the church conquered, becoming the faith not only of the emperor, but of the empire. Galerius. I've woken up, I guess, to get my tongue going here. Galerius. Soon after the battle, Constantine signs this Edict of Milan. Whereas Galerius simply said he'd tolerate the church, Constantine legalizes the church and soon begins to give preference to the church, excusing the clergy from taxes, building buildings, going to Christian worship himself, etc., etc. Thus beginning the fourth phase of the early church. I call it the Constantinian Church for obvious reasons. It was all centered around Constantine. The church arose to dominance to the extent that it soon was not just an influential minority, it was the majority. And began to be seen as the preferred religion. In 321, Sunday is made a public holiday, so all Christians were free from work to go worship on Sunday. Gladiator games for crimes were discontinued. Crucifixion because of Christ was abolished. They could not do it any longer. Constantine even raised his family as Christians, and just before his death in 337, he is baptized and becomes a Christian. Many question Constantine's faith. Was he really a Christian, or did he simply turn to Christianity out of political expediency? The empire was in trouble, it was falling apart, it was divided, it was old, it was losing its vitality, and these constant persecutions were not only a failure, but they were tearing the empire apart. People were looking and saying, why are we doing it to these people? They're our neighbors. Well, they're not bad people. And a good portion of them were Christian, remember, by this time. Many feel that Constantine turned to Christianity to bring unity and vitality to a declining empire. Now, without a doubt, there's some truth to that. For Christianity did many of those things. But Constantine showed his faith was valid in many ways. First of all, he raised his family as Christians. He worked in the church. He gave to the church. The big question is, why did he wait till just before he died to be baptized? That's not as bad as it sounds. That was a very common practice in those days. People saw baptism as washing away of one's sins, and they were beginning to have this idea that one had to pay for one's sins. One must realize that the Protestant view of salvation and the Catholic view of salvation is very, very different. We use the same term, but we don't mean the same thing. When a Catholic, Roman Catholic, talks of salvation, what they mean is Christ saves us from hell. but we have to work our way into heaven. That's why you have purgatory. If you don't do enough good works on earth, you go to purgatory to work off those sins, then you can go to heaven. So this was already becoming very prominent. And the idea was, in baptism, you washed away all your sins. You didn't have to pay for them. You didn't have to earn your salvation, your place into heaven. So people would wait till they were sure they were dying to do it. But this was not even the case for Constantine. I've recently learned, you're always learning things when you're studying history. There's a great new book called The Silk Roads. Very academic, very, very deep book. If you're into that, you'll love it. If you're not, you'd be miserable. But it's a very good academic book. And in it, it mentions that Constantine was actually baptized in the Jordan River. He was on his way to fight the Persians with an army. And what people don't understand was that the Romans were never the only empire in the area. Even though they conquered all the lands around the Mediterranean Sea, there was always this one great empire to the southeast called the Persians. And they fought battles for hundreds of years. There was always a battle going on between the Roman Empire and the Persians. People don't realize that. Well, Constantine was on his way to fight the Persians, and he passed through the Holy Land. And he said, well, while I'm here, I want to be baptized in the Jordan River. Then after his baptism, he never put on his Roman robes again. He never robed himself as an emperor again. He only wore his baptismal white covering, showing how important baptism was to him. He dies before the battle. I'm not sure, the book didn't say what he died of, but it was evidently natural causes, and so this is shortly after he's baptized. Therefore, I don't think you can reasonably say that he was only baptized out of expediency. I think he was more baptized because he was a person of faith. He was doing what was normal in that society, and he had this great opportunity to be baptized where Jesus was baptized. Now, the second question is, was Constantine's legalization of the church good for the church? Remember, in history, every major change seeks to solve the problems of what's been going on before, but brings with it its own problems. The legalization of the church solves a great problem, the persecutions, but it brings on even more problems. We'll look at these here in a minute. Under Constantine, the church is changed dramatically. Money from the government flows into the church. The first great cathedrals are built. The priests and the bishops began to wear more elaborate robes. Because of the church, the church becomes more ornate, and has more and larger structures for worship. Now, there's a reason for this, the big building of the bigger churches, because after the Edict of Milan, literally thousands of people that had been wanting to be Christian shows up at the door of the church. There's no persecution anymore. Matter of fact, you are now associating yourself with the emperor. So there are large numbers of people, and the small home churches or the small inconspicuous buildings that they were using at that time simply would not hold the huge crowds. And so they had to be built bigger churches. But when they did it, they built huge ornate churches, and the priests began to wear these robes with the gold on it and jewels and all this kind of stuff. In fact, the acceptance of the church was so total that a few decades after the Edict of Milan, pagan worship itself is outlawed, and the church is the only legal religion. But with the triumph of the church, there is an unexpected division. Now, there are two causes for this division. As new Christians, by the thousands come into the church, these new believers were very susceptible to heresy and brought a lot of their former pagan superstition into the church. Anyone who's been a pastor of a fast-growing church knows this problem. You have all these people coming in. You don't have time to disciple them well. You're trying, as one growth pastor said, it's almost trying to drink out of a fire hose sometimes. You just feel like it's overwhelming you. And so they come into the church bringing a lot of their pagan ideas with them. The second is there were differences in the church itself. Within a matter of years after the Edict of Milan, Christians began to quarrel among themselves. The reason is obvious from the perspective of nearly 2,000 years. The centuries of persecution had effectively hidden their differences. For one thing, the church couldn't travel openly, and if you did travel, you didn't want to go up to a stranger and say, "Hey, I'm a Christian." You might end up being fed to a lion, Also, when they did find another Christian, they were just so happy to see another Christian, they didn't ask a whole lot of questions. They didn't worry about the little nuances. But as things opened up, this happy state of ignorance soon dissolved into an all-out war within the church. These quarrels covered several centuries and centered around three specific doctrines. First, what is the relationship of the Son to the Father? What do we mean when we say Jesus is the Son of God? Second is likened to it. What do we mean when we say the doctrine of the Trinity? What is the Trinity? How do we define it? And third is the doctrine of the Incarnation. When we say that Jesus is God and man, what do we mean by that? How did we arrive at that term, God-man? It takes a series of several great councils to hammer out the Orthodox faith. Now, this is very important, but it's very complicated. And there's no way I can go into all of this and explain it to you in the time we've got. So I'm going to just hit the high points. But I encourage you, if you find it interesting, go find you a good history book. Probably the best one out there is one called Church History in Plain Language. Excellent book, well written by one of the professors from Denver Theological Seminary. The first council was called to address the relationship of the Father and the Son. And the controversy began in Alexandria of Egypt. Arius was the pastor of a large church in Alexandria. And he came into conflict with his bishop, who is named Alexander. So it's Alexander of Alexandria. Arius asserted that the Word, i.e. the Logos, assumed the flesh of Jesus Christ, but was not the true God. He was of an entirely different nature, neither eternal or omnipotent. When Arius calls Jesus divine, he means this in a proximate sense. He is a lesser or kind of demi or small God, not the eternal and changeless creator. Arius saw Jesus as a created being, emphasizing the idea of the Son being begotten, being born. Therefore, he had to be born later. He had to be the Son. He was not the Father, etc., etc. Now, this idea of small demigods appealed to these newly converted pagans. It felt normal. They came out of a polytheistic background, and they had a hard time in understanding the incarnation, and this answered that question. Remember, whenever you try to answer the question by logic and not by Scripture, you are bound to commit heresy. Never forget that. That's what happened with Arius. He did what seemed logical, and it was heretical. But not only was Arius a very good preacher, but he was a wonderful public relations person. And he put much of his theology into jingles and set them to simple tunes, which were soon being sung by the average person, the average in the streets, thus spreading and popularizing his teaching. When Bishop Alexander, his bishop there in Alexandria, heard what Arius was teaching, he hit the roof. And he calls a synod in Alexandria in 320. Remember, this is only 7 years after the Edict of Milan. And they excommunicate Arius. Arius has a friend who is a bishop by the name of Eusebius. He is the bishop of Nicomedia, which we won't worry about where it is. It's in above. If I remember right, it's above Greece there. Eusebius gives Arius his support, and backed by his friend who removes the excommunication, returns to Alexandria, and there is rioting the streets over who's right. This is one of the largest cities in the whole empire, probably second only to Rome. Egypt was a major province in this time. And so Constantine said, we can't have this going on. The Christianity is supposed to unify us. It's supposed to vitalize us. It's not supposed to tear us apart. So what does he do? He needs the church to unify its faith. In fact, at this point, the Orthodox Christians are going to him and saying, you remember all those persecutions you did against us? Let's do it against the Arians. It's getting bad. Constantine feels he has no choice but to intervene. And this is a normal practice. The Roman emperor had always been seen as the head of the spiritual welfare of the empire. He was over all these pagan religions, and he could dictate to them. And so it just felt natural. If he had always done this, he could continue to do it. As he did it with the pagans, he'll do it now, with the church. And the church at first goes along with this. They're used to it too. This is what the Roman governor always, the Roman emperor always does. Yeah, okay. Because each thinks they can convert the emperor to their side. So to settle the matter, Constantine calls the first of the great councils, which met in Nicaea. When they met, what a change it was from the previous years. None of the bishops had to go in secret. All of them rode in great comfort, surrounded by Roman soldiers, and their expenses are paid by the emperor. Wow, things have changed. The struggle with Arius is settled quickly. When the council convenes, there is this attitude, oh, we're all Christians, we're going to get along, we can talk this out, this is just a tempest in a teapot, it's a matter of semantics, etc., etc. They were sure that we as loving Christians can find a solution. So Arius, on the other hand, comes to the council sure that once they heard him and understood how logical this sounds, they would all agree with him and get rid of that troublesome Alexander the bishop. So Arius gets up, and when he says that Jesus is not equal to the God the Father, but is a lesser God created by God later, the assembly goes berserk. The assembly immediately denounces Arius, the emperor sends him into exile to the area north of the empire, up above Macedonia across the Danube River. Bad idea. We'll talk about this several lectures later, but this is a really bad idea. The question becomes, though, if Arius is wrong, what is right? What should the church believe about the relationship of Jesus and God the Father? After much debate, the Nicene Creed is adopted. The creed is based on a common creed of that time, probably coming from Palestine. And to this they add the words, true God of true God, begotten, not made, of one substance with the Father. And there's where the problem is. One substance. Because the Greek word is homoousion, which means of the same substance. But the controversy will go on for decades and almost ruin the church. But at the time, all seems well. All but 2 of the 300 bishops at the Council of Nicaea signed the final document, and even though there's obvious that many from the eastern part of the empire had some reservations, they go along and sign. You know, if the emperor says sign this document, you'd better sign the document. He's the big guy. He's the guy with all the armies and everything. But almost before the bishops get home, the controversy continues. We'll stop right here and take this up in the next session. Have a Christ-centered day.